So I think we can kind of get started. I want to make sure everybody has the handout, concept of the contract form, as we're going to go through the paragraphs. But if you'll notice, I have a question at the very beginning of this handout in which I ask, what do paragraphs 8, 13, 14, 15, 17, 18, 19, and 20 have in common? Somebody give me an answer. What do you think they all have in common?
They don't have blanks to fill out.
They don't have any blanks or any boxes. They don't have any apparent choices. They just have the pre-printed text, correct?
Yeah.
Now, what's the challenge? What's a tendency when you have paragraphs that the parties to the contract don't seem to have to make a decision about something? What's the risk of those paragraphs?
Being ignored.
Yeah. Skipping over them.
Skipping over, ignore it, say, well, why do I need to read that? There's nothing to do. And the reality is, every one of these paragraphs is an important part of the contract, especially this time of year. We have storms and everything coming through. Paragraph 14, the casualty loss paragraph, is really important because it tells the seller, hey, you've got to fix this. You got to do it before closing. If you don't, it gives the buyer their rights, their choices there. So these are all really important paragraphs. Now, as we look at the 24 paragraphs, we're going to be looking at each paragraph primarily from what's in the pre-printed text. So before the parties enter information in the blanks or check off boxes to make decisions, it's important to understand what that paragraph is for, what it does before the parties make any choices, because they really can't make good choices in the paragraphs that have blanks and boxes if they don't understand what the paragraph is doing. Does that make sense? This is where I tell you, Bob, that really makes good sense.
That makes great sense.
So as we go through these, and we'll talk about these different paragraphs, and we'll talk about the purpose of each one of them, what it's doing, even before the blanks are filled in. Please, as we go through this, as you have questions, be sure to ask them. Now, in the time frame that we have, basically 2 hours, we can't go through all 24 paragraphs in depth. When I used to teach over at Collin College, I taught contracts over there, and we would take the 1-to-4 family contract and we would go through every paragraph in detail. Well, that took 2 4-hour classes to do that. So in the 2-hour classes here, we're dealing with the concept. We're kind of highlighting the concepts, the rights and the obligations of the parties in those paragraphs. So hopefully that'll give you enough additional information to help you. Because one of the things that we're discovering, and we kind of really knew it, but we get feedback from you in the field as you have transactions and you're interacting with someone on the other side who hasn't had this training, who's not as knowledgeable as you are. And I'm certainly not going to be critical of our fellow realtors. We've got a lot of really good people out there, but it really creates a challenge in the transaction if they don't understand what's going on in the contract and the choices people are making. So your knowledge of this helps you protect your client, and sometimes helps you nicely explain to the agent on the other side without slipping over into some kind of a speech, some kind of a preaching like that to them, but kind of help them understand, well, here's what we understand is really going on in this paragraph, so work with me on this, because it really gets to be a challenge, and your understanding of this will help you in those situations, and of course, is very good as you take care of your client in the transaction. Your superior knowledge really stands out at a time like this, and it becomes a very important part of your value proposition for your clients. Okay, so Anything before I go right into paragraph 1 and we look at what's going on there? And it's one of my challenges with Zoom is giving everybody time to, and you can unmute yourself or on your keyboard, you can push the space bar down, hold that down. It's kind of like in a walkie-talkie, and that temporarily unmutes you so you could easily make a comment when you do that. So maybe that's a handy tech tip that you can make use of. So in paragraph 1, even before we put the seller's name in there and the buyer's name in there, the pre-printed text does a couple of important things. It tells us that the seller and the buyer have agreed to do certain things. The seller is saying, yeah, I agree to sell, I agree to convey title, and the buyer says, well, I agree to buy. We will find as we look at this paragraph further that this is a great example of how paragraphs interact. And we'll see how these promises made in paragraph 1 are carried forward in paragraph 9B1 and 9B2. So if you've got your handout that you're looking at there, plus the 1 to 4 family contract beside you so you can look at this, you see I make reference on the second page of the handout to the fact that, the seller has promised to do something like to sell, and he references to what he's going to sell, property. And we'll see that in paragraph 2, we actually will define the property. But what the seller is really doing, and in paragraph 2, of course, we'll talk about how we describe that property. What the seller is doing is not just saying, I'm going to sell, but he's saying, I'll convey title. I have title to this property, and buyer, I will convey that title to you. I will issue you a general warranty deed, and we'll see in paragraph 9B1, that's the language the seller has there. And so it's a very important promise that the seller makes to sell and convey title to this property by being the grantor in a general warranty deed. And the buyer agrees to buy, and what the buyer is saying to the seller, I'll bring good funds acceptable to the escrow agent to closing. And that's where the buyer agrees to do that in 9B2. And so that's an important promise from the seller and the buyer. In fact, this exchange of promises of the buyer and the seller become the consideration for the contract, and it's why we don't actually technically have to have earnest money if the parties choose not to do that, because we've got this exchange of promise of something of value. Any questions on that part so far? Before we get into paragraph 2? Okay. In paragraph 2, we'll find that the very first sentence in paragraph 2 defines the property. The capitalized term property, the property, is defined in paragraph 2 in the very first sentence, so that, improvements, accessories, like land improvements, accessory collect refer to as the property. So when the seller says, I'll convey this property to you, the buyer, what we have in paragraph 2 is what he's going to convey. So the parties need to really understand what the pre-printed text says, because in paragraph 2, paragraph 2A, we've got the legal description, lot, block, subdivision, so forth. But then in 2B and 2C, no blanks, no boxes, but a description of what's going along with the property. And then 2D, of course, has a place where the seller can say, okay, I'm going to convey the property except for, I'm keeping this, whatever that might be. And that's where the seller would list that in paragraph 2D. Any questions so far on that? Now, as we look at 2B and 2C, and I've said this many, many, many times, and we've gotten better at it. I will say we have gotten better. However, paragraph 2 is still the most expensive paragraph for agents, because there's a disagreement between the buyer and the seller on what conveys. what the seller is going to keep and what the seller is going to sell. And when that dispute happens, agents get blamed for it. And the reality is, if the buyer thinks they're going to get the refrigerator and the seller thinks they're going to keep the refrigerator, and they don't agree with what the contract says about that, what generally will happen is an agent will buy a new refrigerator. It's always cheaper to pay for a refrigerator than to defend a lawsuit you may or may not win. And that's why you end up writing the check, not only for those purposes, but to try to keep everybody happy and keep that relationship with your client going and so forth. And so you'll kind of work through that. But in 2B, we need to have a really good sense of what's being said in 2B, because those are the improvements. And we've got an important thing, and we talk about it in the handout in the very first part of 2B. When you look there, and it has a couple of really good words in there after the bold print, after the permanently installed and built in, you see the two words, if any. And that's kind of important, because if we didn't have that there, everything on the list in this paragraph, if it wasn't there, the seller would have to add it. But by having if any there, so it says, here are a lot of things with the property that I'll make sure you get, if any. I may not have some of these things. I may not have, fire detection equipment. I may not have a chandelier. I may not have whatever. So I don't have to add it. You should work through it. So the if any is kind of an important phrase. Permanently installed and built-in items is an umbrella phrase, so that everything in paragraph 2B needs to fall under that definition, permanently installed and built in, or it doesn't apply. The challenge for us as agents, we don't get to define what that means. If your buyer thinks they're going to get something, you better have the conversation and make sure that's in fact what ends up happening in the contract, that it shows up in a non-realty item addendum or in the paragraph 11. Somehow in the contract, parties are clear, whatever this thing is the buyer thinks they're getting, they're going to get. Otherwise, it's going to cost the agent some money. Same thing on the seller side. If a seller feels like he gets to take this with him, whatever this is, like those custom drapes in the master bedroom that match all their, bedroom stuff, you say, I always take that. I can't believe you thought I'd leave that. Well, he needs to make sure that he has that in contract, because, drapes in paragraph 2C are one of the things that are mentioned. And so we need to be comfortable may be too strong a word. We certainly need to be knowledgeable about what's in these two paragraphs and what is going to be included unless the parties choose otherwise. Now, so the permanently installed and built-in items, that's an important phrase. Another one, and we talked about this in the handout, all other property owned by seller and attached to the above described real property. Now, what's important about that is owned by seller. Occasionally, and we actually have had this happen, there will be a tenant in the property, and some of the things in the property are owned by the tenant. And the seller can't convey those items to a buyer because the seller doesn't own them. So if you've got the buyer and there are items that the buyer is really interested in that are in the property, you need to have a conversation with the listing agent. You need to find out if these are owned by the seller or perhaps owned by a tenant. You need to make sure you determine that. And then attached to the property. And Texas Realtors has a nice little three item thing on fixtures, and talks about whether something is a fixture or not, something is included, talks about how it's attached, how it's customized, if it's included in a contract. And so those are important things to keep an eye. The big thing to learn from this situation is the parties need to agree on what the contract says about what stays and what goes. And so you need to do that thing that you're already doing. You need to read the mind of your client. Remember, because you remember that class you took, Mind Reading 101? Remember that? Okay. So because of that, you can read your client's mind and understand what it is they're expecting. And then you can make sure it shows up in the contract. Now, just in case you didn't go to that class, what you need to do is watch your client, pay attention to your buyer, and listen to your buyer. And when your buyer's making comments about something, refrigerator, washer and dryer, chandelier, things like that, then you need to make sure to have a conversation with your buyer, say, okay, is that something you want to make sure is included? If so, we need to address that in the contract. Questions on that? Is that Bob? I really understand it. That's good stuff. I'm good. Okay.
You're doing
Yep.
great, Bob.
Good so far. Okay, good. So let's then, even though in my handout I skip 3, 4, and 5 and go to 6 for a number of reasons. 3 is a very simple paragraph, but paragraph 4, remember, if you are one of the parties as an agent, as a license holder, or if you're related to one of the parties, paragraph 4 is where you need to disclose that. You don't need to get complicated about it. You don't need to, say it like this is my second cousin's third wife from my previous marriage or whatever. Just simply say, buyer's agent is related to buyer such and such or seller such and such. It's as simple as that. But you do need to disclose it. In fact, that's such an important disclosure, and it really is from TREC, that if it does not apply to you, our policy is, I want you to put NA in this paragraph so we know you've read it. And we know you've paid attention to have it just slip past that paragraph. In paragraph 5, just make sure you're comfortable with your language about buyer needs to get the earnest money to the escrow agent in 3 days. And what happens if the third day is a weekend or a legal holiday, and make sure you're comfortable with that process. We're quickly seeing some changes in the marketplace on electronic transfers of money. That will make this easier as we work through it. But right now, it's the delivery of. Now, paragraph 6 is a paragraph that we need to really make sure we understand. And in the very first part of paragraph 6, paragraph 6A 1 through 9, there are actually 9 items listed in the contract, starting at the bottom of the first page and going on to the second page. And your buyer needs to understand the purpose of these 9 items is the title company is saying to the buyer, these are all standard exceptions in the title policy. So when the buyer receives their title insurance policy, there will be a section called standard exceptions. These 9 items will be listed. And what this means is, if there's a problem with any of these 9 items, the buyer can't file a claim with the title company because they're exceptions. They're not covered. Now, we talk about, and we have a number of times, 6A8, which is the exception dealing with the survey, can be amended. We got language in there that helps us know that we can amend that. And my recommendation is that if you have the buyer, they should amend it. It's inexpensive coverage, and it puts the title company, in addition to the surveyor, behind mistakes on a survey, and it can help the buyer in certain circumstances. So I think the cost is 5% of the premium for the title policy. So if the title policy costs $2,000, it costs the buyer $100 to amend this. Very inexpensive, and especially on an existing survey, a buyer should do this, because if there are mistakes on an existing survey, buyer has nowhere to go because he can't go after the surveyor because it's not a survey that was made for that buyer. Everybody go with that? We'll go to 6B.
Yes, sir.
All righty, thank you very much. 6B deals with the title commitment. And it's important information because it tells us who is responsible for issuing the title commitment, and it's the seller. Although the seller, unless they happen to be a title company, have no real ability to do that. And in that same paragraph, the seller gives the title company the authority to do it. But if it doesn't get done, It's the seller who's got a problem because it's the seller's an obligation. And the title commitment, this is something that in 6B, there's a time frame in there where it's to be delivered and when it's to be delivered, and you just need to be comfortable with that timeline. There's really two of them. There's 20-day and a 15-day. And the other thing is the title commitment obligation is not tied to the effective date of the contract. It's tied to when the title company receives a copy of the contract, because they can't start the research and everything on title till they have a contract. Any questions on 6B? Now, 6C. This deals with a survey. And there are three choices. 6C1, seller's going to provide an existing survey and a T47 affidavit to a buyer. 6C2, buyer's going to obtain a new survey and pay for it. 6C3, seller's going to provide a new survey and pay for it. My recommendation over and over and over again, and I know it's an uphill climb, I think a buyer should have a new survey. The overwhelming choice of buyers, easily 80%, is they want to use an existing survey. In fact, you'll see a buyer make an offer and check off 6C1, even when in the seller's disclosure notice, the seller said, no, I don't have a survey. Buyer still checks it off. He just determined to save a few $100s and is not listening to you anyway, and so that's a problem. But whenever you can, recommend to your buyer to obtain a new survey. And so that's either a 6C2 or a 6C3. Questions on those three choices?
I have a question. If the buyer have from seller the what you call the survey, after he handed to him, he can do another survey?
Oh yeah, but I mean, for example, maybe you're saying like the buyer in the contract, we have 6C1 checked off, and the seller gives an existing survey and T47 to the buyer, and the buyer looks and says, you know, okay, I see that and it's acceptable and all, but I think I also want to do a survey on my own. Buyer can certainly do that. They're going to have to pay for it, and it probably doesn't give them a basis for objection unless they put something really good in paragraph 6D. But yeah, a buyer has a right to have a survey done on their own in addition to the choice made in 6C. Now, as the buyer's agent, if you know they're kind of thinking, moving towards an existing survey anyway, you should help them negotiate the correct choice in paragraph 6C. So you don't have that thing that you're dealing with after the fact. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. In 6D, an important thing about 6D, which is the objections paragraph, is it has the language in there that tells the buyer what they have rights to object to, what they cannot object to. And one thing we need to understand is a buyer has a lot of things they cannot object to unless they put something in the big blank in 6D. The buyer, by putting, for example, in the big blank in 6D, that they want to build a big in-ground pool. And then when they get the survey and commitment, they find there are easements in the way. By putting that in the big blank, the buyer has gained rights to object to that. Otherwise, if they don't have anything in that big blank, easements are one of those things that a buyer does not have a right to object to. So you need to have a good conversation with your buyer and make sure if they've got things they really want to do with the property, build a detached garage, put a pool in, use it for investment property, whatever, but if you put something in here, so if it turns out they can't do that, whatever that is, then they have a right to object. And if seller can't fix it, buyer's a right to terminate contract. So now, don't be just putting something in paragraph 6D just in case, because it'll cloud the offer. It'll create a situation where if you're in a competing offer situation and your buyer is one of 5 offers and you're the only buyer who's put something in paragraph 6D, that's going to cloud the offer. And that might keep your buyer from getting, it may be something that the buyer really didn't care all that much about. Says, oh yeah, I want to put something in just in case. Well, he may lose the deal. So you want to be careful when you do that. But you need to understand the timelines that are involved in 6D, the objection timelines. In the small blank in 6D, make sure there is always a number of days. Never can have a situation where there's not a number of days. Even if you don't have anything in the big blank, you still need a number of days in the small blank, because this determines, this is the limiting number of days, and this determines a timeline for the buyer to object. And the pre-printed text, it has a timeline for the seller to cue it, and the timeline for the buyer to accept whether the seller can or cannot, and then whether or not the buyer can object. So you need to be comfortable with those timelines in the pre-printed text in 6D. Everybody good with that? There's a lot of language in 6D. Yes, ma'am, question.
Yeah, Bob, I want to make sure I understand. So you could leave the big blank in D open, but you want to time a number of days in the little blank.
Yes, because there are other, exactly, or never let the little blank stay blank, because the buyer may have something they're going to object to that they have a right to object to, maybe a title issue or something. And so they don't have anything in the big blank, but they still have a timeline for a right to object. I mean, you know, for example, maybe the buyer has now discovered someone from Oklahoma lives next door. Well, you wouldn't want to buy a house in a neighborhood people from Oklahoma live. I mean, come on. So maybe they want to object. Well, they didn't have anything in the big blank, but they still object, and it can give them certain rights to do things as you work through it. And, you know, people accuse me as we look at our fair housing issues and things like that. People accuse me of discriminating against Oklahoma. And I tried to explain to them, well, Oklahoma is not a protected class. But the way something gets put into a protected class is there's a history of discrimination against members of that class. So this person who was fussing me said, well, Bob, there's certainly a history of discrimination, at least by you, against people in Oklahoma. And that's true. That's just how that is. But, you know, we all have our bias. We all have our weaknesses. I'm just willing to admit mine. Just leave it. So we're good with that. So everybody good with 6D and what you can do? And a good question, Laura, is whether you have something in the big blank or not, make sure you always have a number of days in the small blanks. You know, the general concept is that don't leave blanks blank. Now, if you've got the buyer and the buyer says, well, you know, I can't think of anything that I'd put in the big blank. So theoretically, you should put NA in the big blank. However, from the buyer's perspective, the reason we don't like to leave blanks blank is the risk in the countering back and forth, somebody just inserts something in. Well, the big blank in 6D, the objection paragraph, there's no risk of the seller inserting things in that paragraph. Does everybody give that concept? Your buyer doesn't have anything in there, seller, oh no, hey, you know, this is a great backyard for a pool. Let me stick pool in there. Seller's not going to put anything in there. Seller's not going to cloud their own offer. So that's one of those blanks that, because you understand the function of that blank, depending on which side you're on, you may say, okay, probably don't need anything there. But a consistent practice should be, you got a blank that needs to have something in it. If you're not going to make use of that blank, put an NA. We generally don't like blank blanks as a good general rule. Everybody good with that?
Bob, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So I've seen it too where they, like some agents always want to put residential use in there. Is that pretty much like either or?
Yeah, here's the challenge with residential use. It creates a cloud, and the buyer may use it as an excuse to object to something. And the reality is the only time you should put residential use is if there's a question. Like the houses on East 18th Street where you have both commercial and residential. And the buyer wants to know, I can run my shop downstairs and live upstairs. I want to know that I have the ability to use this property for both commercial and residential. In that case, he may put residential use. Maybe it's some property out in the country sitting on 10 acres, 20 acres. He may want to make sure he has the ability to do certain things. Now, if it's a house sitting in the middle of Lakeside on Preston, that's residential. That's all it's ever been. It's all it'll ever be. Really no need to put that additional in there. as you work through it. So that's really not critical. Doesn't make it illegal, doesn't make a contract bad. It just there's really no need to put that in there if it's not necessary, if that's not really a question. Now, another side to the putting something in the big blank. We need to understand putting something in the big blank does not create any obligation of the seller to determine whether or not this can be done or not. It simply gives the buyer a right, nothing for the seller. If the buyer puts in there that he wants to, use this for a daycare center, it's not the seller's obligation to decide if he can do it or not. It's the buyer's obligation to determine if that can be done. That's totally a responsibility on the buyer's side. And as an agent representing the buyer, you need to say to that buyer, you need to check this out. You want to do this? You want to put a daycare center in this house in the middle of the subdivision? You need to determine if you can do that or not. So it has no responsibilities beyond responding to you if you object. Is everybody good with that? Did I hear a question? Kind of, semi? Okay. I see we got a couple of chat. Is there anything in the chat that I need to know about?
Hey, Bob, it's Chantel.
Yes, ma'am.
We've had this conversation before about this whole residential use thing in the big blank. And I remember you saying leaving it blank if you don't have anything. And most of the times I think they just like to see something. And
Yeah.
I've not gotten a contract yet from the other side, the buying side, that did not have residential use only.
Yeah, I agree. We see that a lot. It doesn't make it illegal. It doesn't make it a really bad contract. And if you've got the seller, and this is otherwise a good offer that your seller wants to accept, you're not going to have the seller counter it by taking that out of paragraph 6D. Just going to leave it alone and move forward because it's a fairly unusual situation that can create a problem. The real advocate of not having residential use in there is the late David Fair, who very well-respected attorney, former president of Hexter Fair and so forth. And he said it creates enough vagueness that a buyer can say, well, here's what I meant by residential use. I meant that I could do this, this, and this. But frankly, it's such a rare occurrence that if your seller wants to accept it, fine. If your buyer is determined to put it in there, don't tell your buyer no. If your buyer says, yeah, I want to make sure I want that in there, fine, go ahead and put it in there. It's rare that it'll be a problem on the other side. If your buyer's one of 5 offers and your buyer's put residential use in there but no one else has, that probably won't cloud the offer enough to create a problem on the other side because frankly, most agents don't understand how this works anyway. So it probably won't be a problem. It's when the buyer puts in vague terms that maybe rises to the level of a weasel clause, an easy way for them to get out. Like he wants to run an in-home business or he wants to do such and such. And the seller says, wow, I don't even know if you can do that. I don't think HOA allows you to do that. Well, so that might cloud the offer enough that would cause the seller to either counter or accept someone else's offer. So it's a good point that if you see that in there, Chantel, you don't have to take it out. You don't have to do anything. Just be aware that it's not a good phrase. If you've got the buyer, represent the buyer, unless the buyer brings this up and wants it in there, don't put it in there. No reason to have it in there. Does that help a little bit?
It's not. Yeah, it's never been a big deal. It's never been a deal breaker.
Yeah,
I think
good.
where I've gotten tripped up more on 2D on the exclusions than anything else.
Really? So what's your happens on 2D that created a problem?
Well, I've learned my lesson. That was years ago where I had the selling side and they didn't take out the chandelier till the 11th hour, and the buyer's wife had already seen it and wanted it, and we almost went into a lawsuit over a chandelier. And
That's when we find out that chandelier is a family heirloom brought over from the old country and worth thousands of dollars.
That's true. It was from the old country in Italy, and it was absolutely, and they wanted
Yep.
to keep it. And the buyer's wife said, "Hey, what happened to it?" And they had replaced it with a chandelier from Home Depot, and that wasn't good enough. So
Yep.
I learned my lesson. Anytime they say they want to keep it, take it down before I even put it on the market.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And Chantel brings up a really important point as we work through something like this, and it's the concept that every transaction you do changes what you do in the next transaction. You're in a constant learning mode, just like Chantel points out. She learned from that. She'll never have a chandelier problem in the future. She'll either address it with the seller, get this out of here, before we put it on the market, or in some way, let's make sure we're absolutely clear in the contract, such as 2D, to make sure it's excluded. And the seller needs to understand, by the way, when you've got a really nice custom chandelier, and it's, for example, in the dining room, it may be that some buyers are only choosing that house primarily because of that. They're doing a lot of entertaining. They love that chandelier, and that's why they're choosing that house rather than another house just like it on the next block over because of the chandelier. So there is a risk to the seller that someone may not buy their house because they want the chandelier. But like you say, if they'll get it out of there before they put it on the market, eliminates the problem. There's never a negotiation or battle on it. So really good point. Everybody good so far? We're ready for 6E as in Elmer?
Yes.
6E is a very long and challenging paragraph. 6E2 is where we deal with mandatory HOA, so make sure that's properly checked off. But the other parts of 6E, which essentially deals with 6E 3 through 10, are a lot of notices that you should be somewhat familiar with. We do find ourselves getting into challenges with some of the notices in here, dealing with things like tax districts, tidewaters. We don't have a lot of tidewater problems up here, annexations, things like that. These are all notices that, one, the listing agent has or the seller has certain obligations to disclose certain things, and you need to make sure that you do that. So you need to kind of read through and be familiar with. If you have questions about certain sections in 6C 3 through 10, call me, ask someone on the agent hotline, or a really great resource is to call the title company you do a lot of business with. Either talk to the closer there or talk to one of their title company attorneys, like Charles Kramer, Republic, Keller Milligan, Chicago, any of those others, Sarah with Lawyers Title, people like that can really help you. Good with 6E?
Yes.
Okay, 7A. And hopefully you're going through the handout and you're also going through the contract itself. In 7A, notice there are no boxes to check, no blanks in 7A, but it's incredibly important. This is a huge part of seller's obligations to help the buyer do their due diligence on the property, and addresses 3 important items: access to the property, inspections, and utilities. Access to the property, it talks about who has the ability to access the property, and it's buyer and buyer's agents. And it has a timeline in there, a condition, reasonable times, but it does not address the reason for access. We typically think of it as like inspections, but the reality is, if the buyer needs to access the property to go count the ceiling fans or look at the colors again or whatever, or have an interior designer go in and give them an estimate, that's an access that's allowed. And the buyer can access the property that. Because of the reasonable time situation, and we have this happen a fairly good amount of times, if the agents don't coordinate access to the property in a reasonable way, If the buyer keeps him one day after another day after another day, at some point in time, the seller says, not reasonable anymore. You don't get to come anymore. That's it. And this is true mostly on an occupied property, especially if the seller has a situation where they've got someone who's elderly or someone who's in the house that can't easily leave, and it creates a real problem. If it's a vacant problem, it should never be a challenge with access because it doesn't inconvenience anyone. But that access is really important. But there's nothing in the contract that says this is the reason, and these are the only reasons the buyer can access the property. And that's misunderstood a lot. And the timing of the access is misunderstood. In the last 2 weeks, I've had it 3 times where the listing side said, "Whoa, Bob, I can't believe you haven't explained this to your agent. We're past the option period. We've done all negotiation repairs. There's no reason for the buyer to access the property anymore. End of deal." Well, it's not what 7A says. And the buyer has that right to continue to request and access the property all the way to closing, especially going through towards right before closing, a walkthrough or a reinspection. But the expectation is so high that these are done during the option period. We're still having people, and I'm finding it, frankly, for the most part, with newer agents, with other companies who really haven't had this training, this hasn't been emphasized to them. And it must be that when they're going through the classes to get their license, this is not addressed in those classes. And there are actually 2 contract classes that you take before you get your license, 2 30-hour classes. And evidently, they're just not dealing with this enough because people are showing them the business and they're saying, "Oh, no, option period, that's it. Option period, that's it." And that's just not the case. And you need to understand it. You need to be prepared for the other side, not understanding it and creating a challenge. But that access to the property is very clear. There's no timeline on it. Occupied property, as long as it's reasonable, everything is good. Questions on access?
With COVID-19, does that become a bigger challenge?
It really does. We're having, the COVID-19 issue where sellers really want to restrict access to the property, who comes on the property. And, we have that Texas Realtor form that deals with certification for access to property that listing agents should be using so that anyone who accesses property can make those 7 statements affirmative. But we are seeing more and more people who are very concerned, and we have to respect it. They're very concerned. There's not anything that gives them the right to absolutely deny the buyer's access. However, having said that, we will find much later there are a number of things that are happening during this COVID-19 that are probably totally illegal. There are rules that come out that says, "Oh, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that," that we'll find later are totally unconstitutional. But in the short term, we have to deal with it. We have to respect it. And so if you've got a seller who has concerns with access to the property because of the COVID-19 issue, you need to coordinate that right up front. You need to let a buyer's agent know, here's what we're dealing with. So let's be really, really, considerate here and access the property. Let's restrict it to, these people. We don't want the buyers and their whole family showing up. We want to restrict who gets to access the property, even though nothing in the contract says that. But we want to do that. And if you had a couple of really bad experiences with this, you may even have a conversation with the seller, and you may put language in paragraph 11 where the parties agree to certain procedures on access to the property. Because the COVID-19 is a very real scenario that we need to be considerate of and be able to work through. So you just need to do it. And don't get into the mode of practicing law and giving bad advice or whatever. Just recognize if you've got a client, buyer or seller, who has certain concerns the way they want to do things, you've got to respect that. You've got to help them go through the process. But it's really going to become a buyer-seller issue as we work through this. But we are having sellers who say, "You know what? That's it. I don't want any more people in my house. I will take the risk." And maybe the seller just has had experience of family member or someone close who's had a close call, or maybe they've been tested positive, whatever. And by the way, if the seller has been tested positive or somebody in their family, that needs to be disclosed. Buyers need to know that's going on before they access that property.
Where would they disclose it, Bob?
Well, probably the certification for access to the property is probably a good form to use. And on that form, you look at the 7 questions, number 4, I believe, has a statement in there where the seller would have to line through that and initial it and say, you know what, I've been tested positive, or one of my family members have, or we've had this situation. So anybody who accessed the property, not just buyers, but inspectors, appraisers, anyone else, has that information. It's been disclosed to them. So they can make a decision based on that. So
Thank
that
you.
probably would be the form you'd make use of.
Bob?
Yes.
On this, whether you're representing the seller or the buyer, what's our, rule of thumb of not?
What's our what?
Our rule of thumb or something for not practicing law? How do we know if we've crossed that line?
Well, and it's a great question, James, because it's very easy to slip over the line. What we do is we reference to forms that we can use, the Texas Realtors forms, dealing with COVID-19, dealing with certification access to the property. We look at our policies that we have on what we require. If you're a listing agent, with permission of your seller has to agree with this, you can require certain things of buyers or anyone who accesses the property. Now, be sure you've got permission from your seller to do this, because your seller may get real unhappy, and we've had this happen. A couple of sellers say, you know what, I understand that it's good practice, it's a really good thing to do, that we're going to require buyers to sign up on this before they access the property. A seller may say, you know what, we're getting kickback on this, and we think that there are good buyers out there who really would make a good offer, who are just not willing to follow all these rules and sign off and fill out forms. Seller's got to make a decision. And we had the exact situation happen with a listing agent and a seller probably 2 weeks ago. And you know, we said, seller, you get to make a risk-based decision. You get to say, you know what, we're going to have the forms in the house. Hopefully they'll complete them and sign off on them and leave them for us. But the seller said, we're no longer going to require any buyer to fill out these forms and sign them before they get to see the house. Now, there was that same seller, by the way, we did have it set up so that people could virtually access the property and get more information about the property before they went to physically view it, and that's helped a lot. But you really have to be sensitive and make use of those things. And the thing that'll keep you from practicing law, James, is simply provide your seller or your client with the information and let them make a decision. It's their decision to go through it, and we'll respect that.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Because this is not, this whole COVID thing and access property and following the rules, you know, mask and gloves and all those kinds of things, that's not just important from a liability standpoint. It's important because it's the right thing to do to protect people's health. And just one of those things that we want to kind of be on board for as we work through it. Because one of the things that we're clear of, and when I talk to our E&O people and different attorneys involved, they say, we will have test cases. There will be people who come down with COVID-19 and they blame it on an open house they went to, or it's a seller who blames it on allowing people into their house, and they're going to sue the broker and the other agents and whatever. So we will have a test case. And at this point in time, so far, our E&O insurance companies and our general liability insurance company says you have no coverage for any of that. Now, they're all working with the Texas Department of Insurance in Texas to see if there's some kind of a rider or something can be added to an insurance policy to create some protection. We're just not there on that yet. I suspect that if this continues on somewhat of the same level as they are, with the legislature moving into session this next year, 2021, I think it's very likely we'll see some bills come through that address that, because some of the people are talking about a lot. But this is, you know, something we need to really be pretty comfortable with. Good with that? So one thing, access to properties in 7A. The other, I talk about in my handout, are inspections. And that's just like James points out, that's an access problem. That's a COVID-19 problem. The inspectors have really done a great job of creating some protected inspection processes where they can do a lot of things and limit it. And one of the things that we want to do is when we set up an inspection, if you've got the seller, for example, actually if you have either side, we really want to limit who's going to be there. The seller shouldn't be there if at all possible. In the inspection, while we want a buyer to certainly have the information from their inspector, they probably should not be there the entire time of the inspection. That's increased risk for that buyer of exposure to things. And if they can just come in towards the end and get the information or have because the inspector is doing a really good job of following the protocol and being protective and safe distancing, mask, and things like that. So it's really turned out to be a pretty good situation. So utilities, we have found ourselves with the challenge, even though utilities are required to be owned during the entire term of the contract, we find with certain institutional sellers, relos, pre-foreclosure situations, that there's sometimes some utility challenges. So if you've got the buyer, make sure you have good conversations with listing agents to get this worked out. And the parties can even agree. I mean, they can put something in paragraph 11 where the seller agrees utilities are going to be owned, and generally it's going to be the listing agent who will take care of that during certain times for inspections, for re-inspections, for walkthroughs, and have those there. But that's something the parties can agree to. Otherwise, during the entire term, they need to be there. Question on the inspection situation and utilities, we're pretty good with all that. We just had one recently. It was a property that had some real challenges with it, and the institutional seller in the situation, there was a limitation on the utilities. For example, probably been vacant for some time. There'd been no gas on for a long time, and the seller didn't want gas to be turned on because of the risk of what would have to happen since it's been off for a long time. And so the buyer and the seller agreed, because this was a true as-is purchase. Buyer and seller agreed in the contract that the buyer was okay with gas not being turned on. So they didn't have, before closing, anything that would have dealt with inspection or anything dealing with the gas needing to be on. So they accepted that. And the buyer certainly has a right to say, yeah, I'm okay with that or not, because they get a good deal on the property and they say, you know what? We understand why the seller and I are willing to do this and go through the process. We're okay with it because we're getting such a great deal. We can live with that. But that's parties agreeing as they work through that under special circumstances to go through and work through that.
So Bob, if you had a writer from a third party, it would typically say something like that. Do you still need to reference it in number 11? Or just add that to the list of items that are on the contract?
Well, I think you probably would add that to paragraph 22. That's a good question, where the parties agree. If you've got something in the addendum that's going to be added that addresses utilities issue, like you list that in paragraph 22, I certainly don't have a problem with adding something in paragraph 11, special provisions, kind of suspenders and belts approach to make sure everybody's clear. Yeah, here's what it is. Although the addendum will likely have language in it that says if there's any conflict here with the contract, the addendum prevails. So everybody's clear, because the addendum said be no gas or whatever it might be with utilities. It's a good question, Laura. Does that semi-answer that?
Yep, thank you.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. In 7B, we're talking about the seller's disclosure notice. And if you're not ever sure what section of the property code the seller's disclosure notice is included, it tells you right there, section 5.008. And you should be somewhat familiar with the 11 exemptions, the 11 sellers. If they fit one of these 11 exemptions, they're not required to complete a seller's disclosure notice, which would give them the ability to have in the contract 7B3 checked off. I just had a situation with one of our agents who's taking a listing. It's an estate situation, and because of the will, one of the children of the deceased is an executor in terms of the will. Well, on the list of 11 exemptions, that's number 5. When you're operating as an executor, trustee on the estate, so forth, you're not required to do a seller's disclosure notice. So you can legitimately check off 7B3. The question that this agent had on that was, okay, the seller now, who is an executor under the will, is out of state and has never visited the property, never had any information about condition of the property. So they understand. So because of that, they don't have to do a seller's disclosure. Well, being clueless about the property doesn't get you on the list of exemptions. They get to be exempt because they're executor under the will. Now, I did have to point out that if this person who is executor under the will, and turns out it's going to be one of the heirs, knows anything about the condition of the property, even though they're exempt from the seller's disclosure, they're not exempt from disclosing what they know about condition of the property, any known defects. In this particular case, because they were out of state, had never seen the property, they really had no information about it, and so there wasn't anything. And if you're a seller and you have information, maybe you're a seller and you've lived in the property last couple of years, taking care of your last parent who just now died, and you know all kinds of things that happened the last couple of years. Those are things you need to disclose. There's really not any place to really, there's not a special separate form on that, but that person could use probably the TREC 4-page sales disclosure and tell what they know in that, and do it, even though that person is technically exempt from sales disclosure. That'd be a fairly easy way for them to disclose, here's some known defects that you have to do. I see Jenny coming up with a question.
Well, I had one, Bob, but I think you probably answered it. But I had a farm and ranch where the seller refused to do the seller's disclosure.
Okay.
And Marcia was like, no, they don't, there's not a choice. They have to do it if they're living there.
Yeah,
Correct?
and they really do. Unless they're on the list of 11, and you need to be fairly comfortable with that list, and section 5.008 talks about who those 11 are. Being clueless about the property doesn't get you on the list. Never having lived there doesn't get you on the list. But sometimes you'll have a seller who just won't do it. Now, if it's going to be our listing, we would want to advise the seller why they should do it, give them all the reasons for it, do that in writing, such as an email, and decide if we're willing to accept that listing without the seller doing something that really is required of them under the property code. Because the property code is state law and requires things in principles. Now, the real consequence, immediate short-term consequence for the seller is the buyer's rights of termination. So if the seller hasn't provided a seller's disclosure notice, it's likely that 7B2 is what will be checked off in the contract, which means the buyer has essentially an unrestricted right to terminate anytime prior to closing, or if they finally do receive it, 7 days after that at closing, whichever comes first. So it's a very powerful right of termination. That's the big risk to the seller. Now, the other risk of the seller by not doing this is if the buyer discovers something after the fact, after they've had a closing, and they really couldn't have found out before, but now they've discovered here's a problem, and the seller knew it. So yeah, now we know why the seller didn't want to do a seller disclosure notice. That's a risk to the seller because they may be guilty of failing to disclose or misrepresentation. And the most common lawsuit in real estate is the buyer suing the seller after closing for the seller's failure to disclose or misrepresentation on the property. So the seller needs to know they've got that risk. Now, once you've advised the seller of that risk, then we've got to look and say, okay, we're willing to take that risk. you know, the seller is willing to take that risk. We've advised them why they should, you know, do it, and they decide not to. We think it's a good listing. We think it's otherwise a good seller. And so we're willing to move forward under these conditions, recognizing that this might run some buyers off who just say, whoa, what's the seller trying to hide? You know, they obviously hiding something because they wouldn't feel complete this. So we need to decide. Now, the other side of this is, as an agent, if you in some way, shape, or form decide that this is the first of many red flags, this is an indication that this is going to be a challenging seller, maybe a very high maintenance seller. You've got to decide if you're willing to deal with this. This may just be enough of a red flag to say, you know what, it's not worth it. Because because if that seller gets sued 6 months later, so will we. They'll almost certainly include us, which is, you know, and even though we weren't guilty of anything, worked through the process, it's going to create a situation where it's going to at least cost us the amount of our deductible, our E&O policy, because when we get sued, we turn into E&O. And we've been able to negotiate a good policy now. Our deductible is $5,000. And so, you know, that's going to be our maximum financial risk there. But you need to really look and see, is this just a first indication of a continuing problem or challenge? Especially if you have some of those really sneaky, creative sellers like Jeannie Gary ends up with. Hi, Jeannie. She always has such fun people, such challenging people that keeps her entertained and keeps me with new examples of what crazy people are doing out there. So it's real challenging. So a seller's disclosure notice, you really want to try to get it. And if you don't get it, you want to figure out, wow, why? What's really going on here? Because we don't want to be at risk, because if something happens to the seller later, it's going to happen to us too if we're the listing broker. Are you good with the seller's disclosure? And remember, even though the property code requires this of the seller, the only real penalty to the seller in the short term is a buyer can terminate the contract. It's giving the buyer a free option period, maybe for the entire term of the contract. So we need to
Bob,
make sure.
there was a question on the seller disclosure notice. I think you've already gone over it, but just to clarify, is an executor seller disclosure notice considered a courtesy, or does it hold as much weight as it would under normal seller conditions?
So tell me what you mean by an executor or seller disclosure notice.
Okay, that's Becky Roach. Becky, step up.
So what are you thinking here, Becky?
Sorry, multitasking here. I'm just wondering if it is, well, I thought I put it pretty clearly, so I'm not sure what the question is here.
What is an executor or seller disclosure notice?
Well, one filled out by an executor of an estate.
Okay, so recognizing they don't have to do that, what you're saying is, if they do this, if they go ahead and provide it, even though technically they don't, can they be held responsible? And the answer is yes.
Okay.
Because we've got to presume the only reason the seller would go ahead and do this, unless they're operating under some advice of counsel, the only reason they do this is there is information about the condition of the property that they have to disclose, and this is just the way they're going to disclose it.
Yes, they helped maintain the property as the.
They know information. They know things.
Right. Okay, so
So this would be a good thing to disclose, but they need to understand they're going to be held responsible for what they say. Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Good question. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. 7C, dealing with the lead-based paid addendum, which is a requirement under federal law. Had an interesting situation just a couple of days ago where we had the seller and an agent with a very large, well-known independent company named after a fine young lady who's not all that young anymore. I'm actually passed away. But anyway, in which the seller did complete, as he should, a lead-based paid addendum completed it, signed it, the listing agent signed it, they had an MLS. And that's the absolute correct way to do that. So then the buyer can pull that down and the buyer can complete their part. But the buyer's agent, and don't understand the why of it, I think it got worked out, but buyer's agent says, well, my buyer's not willing to sign that until they've had inspection because the buyer intends to have a lead-based paint test done. Now, they have a right to do that under federal law. Buyer gets the right to do that. But they weren't willing to sign that form until they've done it. And one has nothing to do with the other. Two totally separate issues. Because on the lead-based paint addendum, where the seller discloses whether they have knowledge or not, the buyer has a right to do inspections, and that's actually in paragraph C there, and they can check off to have a right to do it. They're not going to waive it. But the more important thing in lead-based paint addendum, paragraph D, is the buyer acknowledges receipt of the lead-based paint pamphlet. And that's the big requirement. And that's what they really, the thing. So them not actually receiving this form and not completing on the buyer side has nothing to do with their right to have a lead-based paint inspection done, a present lead-based paint done. Two separate issues. But in the short term, that's what it takes to have us. And this was about a $1.6 million piece of property. So this was a really good deal for us and our agent. And we did the right thing. Our agent did the right thing in having the seller complete the lead-based paint addendum. They signed it, agent signed it, and they've got the dated signatures. It's really now in the ballpark of the buyer and the buyer's agent. Frankly, won't care. We've done our job. We produced it. We've sent it to the other side. We now have documentation to have that. If they choose not to perform under that, if anything happens as a result of this, they'll be liable. And the other thing that we need to make sure that our seller understands, buyer does these inspections, this is lead-based paint, and they can do it extraordinarily easy. I mean, they don't have to have an invasive inspection. I mean, literally it can be as simple as, checking off a few pieces of paint or something like that, or because you have to have a specialist who's qualified to do that. But even if the buyer finds there are lead-based paint issues there, seller has no obligation to take care of it. They have no obligation to fix the problem. Now, the seller would have, if this deal falls apart, the seller would now have a report, information, there's lead-based paint, so they would have to amend to change their lead-based paint addendum because they now do have knowledge of lead-based paint there, which previously they didn't have. So you have to take those steps and go through that. Questions on that? So we have 7B3 checked off, make sure, that they meet one of the 11, and 7C, a lead-based paint addendum, because EPA audits real estate companies, and they're back doing it again in Texas. And they go to a real estate company and they say, okay, we want you to pull out 6 files in which the property has a requirement for the lead-based paint addendum. And then those auditors review those 6 files to make sure the rules were followed. And they almost always find a problem. And they find the broker and the agent thousands of dollars. $3, $5, $7, $10,000, not unusual. And the big thing that generally happens, either a box was not checked where it shows the buyer has the pamphlet, or the signatures don't work. The buyer's signature was before the date of the seller's signature. Can't be that way. The seller needs to disclose what they know before the buyer signs off on it. So we need to make sure that if this is a lead-based paint addendum issue, that it is back completed and taken care of. And that's hard because sometimes you have a hard time getting people on the other side to sign off on it, to do something. And if you've got the buyer, you would really like that information from the listing agent where the seller's already signed off on it. And sometimes that's a really hard thing. They just don't have time for it. They got a hot piece of property, get a lot of offers. They say, you know what, we'll get to it at some point in time, but right now, if your buyer wants to make an offer, send it in. Well, okay, do that. Make sure you've got good documentation that you've done all you can, and that the listing agent and the seller, by by way of the listing agent, has not completed something the federal law requires them to complete. We can't make them do something. We just do what we can on our side. You will have good documentation that you, in fact, have given the pamphlet to your buyer. So that's resolved, and you're good for that. We good? Questions on that?
As far as good documentation, Bob, just in your correspondence, or do you?
Yeah, emails are sufficient. Courts like emails. Trek likes email because they're time dated and everything. So those are good. Just make sure you keep all that documentation. So if we get audited, then we've got the documentation.
Thank you.
7D, we throw around the phrase a lot, as is. These are as is contracts, and virtually all the courts in Texas have in fact agreed with that, confirmed that. And what it means is at the time of the contract, everything in the agreement between the buyer and the seller are right now in the contract. And the buyer has said to the seller, hey, I'll pay $200,000 for your property based on what I know now. And the seller makes no assurance to the buyer that, about condition like that. And there is no agreement in the contract unless you put it in there like in 7D2, where sellers agreeing to repair, complete repairs, whatever. Totally an as is, where is. Now sometimes we see a seller want to put something in paragraph 11, establishing that this truly is an as is paragraph. And the seller says, I want the buyer to know I'm not going to do any repairs. Now the seller needs to be clear that in spite of that, the buyer still has the rights to inspect the property. In fact, the buyer still has the right, based on that inspection or based on any information they have, to send a request to the seller saying, you know what, I really want you to take care of these repairs. They're major repairs or safety issues or lender required repair issues, and you really do need to take care of it. Seller can say, no, I'm not going to do it. Because seller said, no, which part of I'm selling you this as is, where is, I'm not going to do anything. And by putting that in there, sometimes the seller says, I just want to warn the buyer while they can do inspections and ask for repairs, I'm not going to do anything. So they don't get to fuss at me later about all this money they spent on inspections and options like that, not knowing that I wouldn't cooperate, because buyers and buyer's agents expect, you know what, we'll do an inspection during the option period, we'll send a repair amendment over, and we'll negotiate something, and if we don't get it, then we can terminate the contract. And so buyers expect that. Sometimes sales says, I don't want them to be misled. I want them to know right now what they see is what they're getting, and that's it. And that's, I understand the reason for that. It's not necessary, because frankly, that's what paragraph 7D says. But the reality is, no. Seller not required to do anything. And buyer needs to understand they have agreed when they accepted, when they entered to the contract, they agreed they're okay with what's there. And nothing in the contract, by the way, gives the buyer a right to terminate the contract if the seller doesn't agree to repairs. That's not a contingency that exists anywhere in the contract. That might be the reason the buyer is going to terminate during the option period or mandatory HOA or social disclosure, whatever. That might be the reason, because they expect the seller to do something. But that in and of itself is not a basis. When you look on the buyer's right to terminate contract, Trek promulgated form, that's not one of the things that creates a basis for right of termination to work through that. So true as is paragraph. And buyer and seller need to agree that. And in 7D, 99% of the time, 7D1 is checked off. Buyer is truly buying as is. If 7D2 is checked off, then during that time frame, during that 7D2, a buyer would put something specific in 7D2 saying, yeah, I accept it as is, provided you, the seller, do this, such as replace a roof. And they'd be very specific on that or whatever. Can't put anything in 7D2 that addresses in some way future inspection. One recently we looked at, the buyer wanted to put in 7D2 that they wanted to have a termite inspection done that's satisfactory to the buyer. Well, even though that's a treatment, having that conditional information in there, satisfactory to the buyer, creates a condition that is not acceptable in 7D2. Now, with the good attorney language, you can put something in paragraph 11, not in 7D2, because the as-is function is very important in 7D. Question on that? Uh, 7E. This gets to the issue of lender-required repairs. There's occasionally we run into a situation where a buyer, either through the appraisal or some other issue, discovers here's a problem, maybe from the inspection, and it rises to such a level that the buyer's lender says, if we don't take care of this, we're not going to fund the loan. So the buyer says to the seller, you know what? Our lender says, if we don't have this foundation work, if we don't have this roof replaced, if we don't have this major AC work done, they're not going to do the loan. So because of that, buyer says to the seller, so you've got to fix that because our lender requires it. Otherwise, they won't fund the loan and deal falls apart. The reality is, paragraph 7E is very clear. Neither party is obligated. But it's also clear if they don't work something out, if this truly is a lender required repair, where the lender says if this doesn't get done, we're not going to fund the loan, then the parties say, okay, if we don't come to some agreement, contract will terminate and buyer gets their money back. So we need to be pretty comfortable with what parties have actually agreed to in 7E. Work through it. Questions on 7E, lender required repairs?
None here.
Okay, good. If we're ever, and we shouldn't be, because most of you guys have been in my classes, I've talked about this a number of times, but if you're ever not entirely clear about repairs, buyer and seller have agreed to repairs, maybe a buyer even had something initially in the contract where the seller agreed to replace a roof, for example. If we've got repairs agreed to either in the original contract or repair amendment later, 7F talks about who can do those repairs, the timing of those repairs, and creates a scenario that the intent of 7F, and when I was on the Broker Lawyer Committee, we actually did some wording changes here. It was since reworded again fairly recently by the latest Broker Lawyer Committee, in which their real intent is they want to make it clear these are not things the seller can do. These are things that if there's a license required, that party has to have a license, or they need to be in a business where they ordinarily do these, because a number of things in Texas, there's no license required. No license for a roof, for example. No license for sheetrock repair, things like that. So as they go through the process, the 7F says, okay, so let's do this, and it needs to be somebody that this is their business, by the way, which would include handyman. The handyman, if they do these kind of things on a regular basis, that's their business, and they qualify for that. The real intent here is not to let the seller do it on their own on the cheap. Now, the parties have an absolute right to work through this and give the seller some rights if both parties agree to it. The seller, for example, may own an air conditioning company, and they've actually used their own company for the past 10 years, you know, maintaining the property, servicing the HVAC and all that. So in a case like that, the buyer may say, okay, because of that, we'll allow this seller to do these air conditioning repairs or whatever that showed up in the inspection. We're okay with that. To make that happen, it'd be a good idea to go to paragraph 11, special provisions, where a buyer says, you know, we do allow for these specific repairs for the seller to do these or the seller's company to do these because that's a business they're in. And they can do that. Other semi-major kinds of things, the big fear is when the seller does it, they're doing it on the cheap, and it's really not done to a level of quality that the buyer would want to be comfortable with as you work through it. there is an interesting thing in paragraph 7F that gives a buyer a right to do repairs. That's almost always a bad idea. Because if something happens and you don't close on the deal, buyer just now fixed up the seller's property, which he very much appreciates. He says, oh, by the way, I got this other house over here. Would you like to try to buy that one too? It needs some repairs, so you seem to be good at this repair stuff. So don't want to do that. Just don't ever want to be in a case where you do that. But you need to be comfortable with 7AF and who can do these repairs and the timing of them and how that works out. And if a seller doesn't do them, this is a performance issue for the seller. If a seller doesn't do repairs that are agreed to, such as a repair amendment, then the buyer could hold the seller in default and go after the seller under paragraph 15, the default paragraph. Question on 7F?
Nope.
So be sure in 7F that you, because there are no choices, no blank to fill out there. So you're really comfortable with the buyer and seller agreeing to do. Now, the other thing in 7F, which I don't actually have in the handout, paragraph 7H, dealing with the residential service contract, home warranty. I understand you guys are in the middle of it. And you're there dealing with your client, and the range of personalities of clients and demands of clients is huge. I understand that. It's easy just to have these conversations. It's easy for me to set up these rules in the academic environment and situations like this. Home warranties, inspectors, lenders, title companies, roofers, and all these create a challenge. And we've got the vendor statement policy form that we give to our clients. Say, you know what? We're not going to recommend anybody. You've got to do your own research, and here are some names or whatever. You need to really make sure you've done that really well. You've documented it. So when a buyer makes a choice, for example, for a home warranty company, to deal with a registered service contract, which is a home warranty, then they recognize that this was totally their choice. You gave them the names of several companies. You gave them the marketing information, the marketing rep with that company, so they can call them and talk to them. But the buyer needs to do the research and make their own decision. Because when something goes wrong, and it will, and the home warranty company doesn't do repairs, doesn't service it like the buyer expected to, you're going to get the phone call. And if they feel like this is the home warranty company that you recommended, then they're going to blame you and blame us for it. So you really got to be really careful. We're actually going to talk about these limitations more towards the end of the month. We have an advanced class, advanced contracts. We spend a little bit more time on that because we've had some trends and things going out there that deal with some really serious limitations we have that we've got to be more aware of than before, because it's really coming back and biting us. So we're going to really talk on some of that. So paragraph 9, our closing paragraph. We've already talked about 9B1 and 9B2. I feel silly saying this next thing, but because I've had it happen at least 3 times this year, you've allowed your client to enter into a contract either as a buyer or a listing agent, either revenue buyer or seller. You've allowed them to be in a contract, and the date in paragraph 9A was a holiday or a weekend. Don't do that. When you're writing an offer, make sure you've got a calendar there. Make sure when you pick a date that works for both parties, it's not a weekend or a legal holiday, because we create challenges. And clients who already were mad at us for other things are just looking for extra things to be unhappy about and to fuss at us about. So please make sure you've got a calendar there. I really feel silly even saying this, but because it keeps happening, I say, maybe I need to say it in a better way or something. I don't know, because it does happen. I mean, the other interesting thing, and frankly, I would never have thought about this, except that we had, and this actually was several months, actually it was last year. If you got the buyer, and it's also true of the seller, really listen to them. We had a buyer, and they were already unhappy anyway, and this is one of several points that they used against our agent. They were really superstitious, and they did not want to have a closing on Friday the 13th. I'm going, really? That's silly. But some people take that really seriously, and they really weren't paying attention that the contract was on Friday the 13th. And they just, once they really discovered that, said, whoa, that's wrong. Now, we went through the process to try to renegotiate, to amend the contract, change the closing date. So it wasn't on Friday 13th, but things happened, and there were things that just went forward to the point to where it really did need to close on Friday the 13th, and we finally got it worked out. But kind of be sensitive. One of the things we have every year is the 9/11 anniversary date. And there are people out there who just don't want to have a closing on a date like that because maybe personal experiences. So you just need to make sure that when you put a closing date in here, make sure you've had conversation with your client. You're looking at what's going on. You pick a good day, hopefully a day that's more towards the middle of the month, middle of the week, not a Monday, not a Friday, not the last working day of the month, certainly not the last working day of the month of the last day of the quarter. So make sure you've got some good dates going in there. So question 9, or paragraph 9. Yeah. And we've already talked about 9B1 and 9B2. You need to make sure everybody understands what they've agreed that they're required to do in 9B3. Sometimes you can say, well, wait a minute, where did I agree to do that? Well, 9B3. You got to sign off on everything necessary to be able to close this deal. You just have to make sure you work through that. And then 9B4 talks about, everything has to be paid off at closing, but no liens or assessment unless there's something the buyer's assuming as you work through that. Just make sure you kept that. Now, all the paragraphs in the contract are important. Everybody agree with that?
Yes.
Some are probably more important than others. And what makes some paragraphs more important than others is that they continue to have situations that cause people to be unhappy, and for me to get the phone call, or Chris to get the phone call, or even worse, Mike Brody gets the phone call. And paragraph 10 is one of those paragraphs. The choice of closing and funding being the choice for transfer of possession from seller buyer is really key. So closing and funding versus according to a temporary residential lease, points out to us the possession issue in some ways is more important because it is, and 95%, most of the time it's going to be to the seller. Because when we have a seller's temporary residential lease, the seller is going to deliver possession at a time different than when they convey title. The seller has already had a closing and a funding, and the seller under paragraph 9B1 has executed a general warranty deed, and the buyer now owns the property. But the seller is staying in the property under a seller's temporary residential lease, which means the seller has not given up possession to the buyer. And even though the seller doesn't own the property anymore, under paragraph 14 of the seller temporary residential lease, the seller is still responsible for the property. That responsibility is huge. As we're going through a time of the year where thunderstorms pop up and we have challenges, rainstorms come through, roofs have hail damage, tornado comes along. When we had the situation a few years ago over in the Rowlett area where the tornadoes came through, and in some blocks almost demolished almost all the houses. Well, we had houses over there that affected, that the seller had a closing, but still had possession of the property. And it became a huge issue about whose insurance is going to cover tornado damage to that property. So the possession issue versus the title issue is incredibly important. That's why you see in paragraph 10 in bold print, consult your insurance agent prior to. This is one of probably 3 absolutes that we have. And when I say we have an absolute, what do you think I really mean here? What do I expect of you?
To do it, whatever it is.
To do it every single time, not occasionally, but in every case in which title and possession happen at different times, whether it's buyer taking possession prior to or seller possession after, you have to tell your client, you've got to talk to your insurance agent. You do that in writing, such as an email. You have to do that. And we actually have that in paragraph 10 of the contract. We also have that in paragraph 17 of the lease. Have to tell them, because when that seller stays in 2 weeks after closing and we have hail damage, things happen, it's going to be an immediate important question, whose insurance applies? Because the seller still lives in the property, but no longer owns it. And he had a homeowner's policy, before closing. Well, does he have any coverage now? We don't know. And we really don't know. That's why we've got to have them talk to their insurance agent. Buyer owns the property, but has a tenant in his property, hasn't taken possession. So when the hail damage happens, is it the buyer's insurance company? We don't know. We truly don't know. We have to advise them. That's an absolute requirement. You have to do this every single time in which you have the possession of the property and the transfer of title happen at different times. You have to advise your client to do that, because they're not reading. Even though it's in paragraph 10, bold print, they're not reading that. They're not paying attention. They're trusting you. In fact, we had a recent challenge, and I had to get into a conversation with our client, our former client. And he said, well, you know what? We didn't notice that. We just trusted our agent. We trusted our agent to make sure we knew what was important. And that's exactly, now whether or not that's really true or not, or that's just their way of escaping responsibility, doesn't matter. We've got to make sure we do it. And my feeling is, if we have an absolute rule, and if you really work hard at that absolute rule, that means that you'll do it most of the time. I know we're all human. I understand that. But the more you push this, the more you put in your system, the more that it will happen. You have to do that. Now, here's another little thing I want to say. And remember, I really like you guys. You're my people. And I really do have a great feeling. I thank my lucky stars every day that I'm in business with you guys. I mean, I really like you. But there's an important principle. When I give you advice, like I just did, please follow it. Just had an agent recently who I gave some really good advice to, didn't follow it. And we had to have a long talk. And I told him, I said, here's the rule. If I give you some really good advice, and I'm optimistic, most of my advice is good. But when I give you some really good advice, in the back of your mind, you say, oh, that's another one of Bob's things. Oh, we know how Bob gets on all this. My gosh, one more time. If you're not going to follow it, if you're not going to pay attention, please tell me. Let me know right then. Gee, I need to explain this in a different way. I need to follow up with an email to you explaining, okay, I've advised you to do this. You decide not to do it.
Just clean it up.
Here's our liability. Here's our risk. Question? Yes. We good? Please follow it. And if you're not going to follow it, let me know. Be respectful. Say, shh, Bob, you're just full of it. You know that, don't you? One more thing. Is it ever going to end? Well, it'll end when no one I work with ever makes any mistakes ever again. That'll never happen because we're all human and we all will do that. That's just the nature of the beast. But please,
Amen.
if you're going to follow, if I'm going to give you some really good advice, because none of my rules are arbitrary. None of them are arbitrary. All of them are based on experiences. All of them have a good basis behind them. When I say, here's what I'd like you to do. Question? Yes. Have any questions? Robin, you have a question? Looks like the thing popped up. We good? So please do that. I mean, just, one, if no other reason, just out of a little bit of respect, please do that.
Bob,
Question?
it's clear you have our best interest at heart. And I think it's more than deserving of respect and listening to you because you are the expert when it comes to keeping us out of trouble.
I try real hard to keep you out of trouble. And I really appreciate that. I appreciate that you'll support me in this. The little phrase, love me, hate me, just don't ignore me. Don't ignore this. This is really important thing to work through it. So everybody good with 10 and how important that is?
Yes.
I kind of skipped paragraph 11 because my basic rule in paragraph 11, leave it alone. If you're going to stick something in there, call me first. Because it may be something that you need an attorney to work up the language or whatever, and we've got good attorneys out there and who help us with all that stuff. But otherwise, don't be sticking things in paragraph 11. 12, paragraph 12, 12A1 and 12A2, if you wonder who's got to pay what, tells you right there. Sets forth all the expenses, all the expenses of the party. So, just go through that. The other little thing in paragraph 12C, sometimes we have a situation where the parties have agreed to certain things and expenses are more than what they think they've agreed to in the contract. This is a safety net. But if all of a sudden there's an expense that's greater than what the buyer or seller agreed to do, they have a right to terminate the contract. Actually, either party has a right to terminate the contract. On a little bit of a safety net, we don't see it happen a lot, but it's really a safety net. Proration, paragraph 13, really be comfortable with the title company and title company's policies. We're finding ourselves with some challenges in paragraph 13, because while we're dealing with taxes closing this year, working off the most recent taxes, if you've got a seller who's got homestead exemption and other kind of exemption, and he's going to carry those forward to the next property, then you need to really be careful in proration and give good warning to the buyer. Says, you know what, you may find yourself with some totally different expenses after the fact. So you need to be able to work through that. So proration is meant to be a nice fair share thing. And if there's some changes or whatever after the fact, they all agree to do it, working through it. Paragraph 14 is our casualty loss paragraph. And we kind of talked about it a little bit earlier. It's a really important paragraph. Sellers got real good obligations. And frankly, we're in an area of the country where we have the hail damage, we have the wind storms, we have those kind of things. And when the parties are in a contract, what do they do? Well, paragraph 14 says, yeah, here's what you do. Here's how that works. And you need to be comfortable with that. Paragraph 15. This is our legal paragraph. This is our default paragraph. Default is a legal issue. And while several places in the contract have performances, and it's fairly common for, when we've got a seller who just says, well, I'm not going to do this, and it's a performance issue, it's fairly reasonable to think, well, you're in default. We don't ever get to say that as agents. We don't get to say when the buyer says, well, the seller agreed to do this. Here's a repair they agreed to do. So they're in default now. So I can sue them, right? No, what you can do is talk to a good attorney. Because we don't get to say this person's in default or not in default. That's a legal opinion. That gets into that. We need to have a sense of performances, what the parties are required to do, what they've agreed to do. But what paragraph 15 really does is it gives both parties saying, you know what, you think the other party defaulted, you're the non-defaulting party, here are your remedies. And they're set forth, and they're almost the same, but not exactly. You know, when the seller default, I mean, you know, when you see in paragraph 15, if the buyer defaults, like he fails to close or whatever, you know, the seller can do certain things such as, you know, specific performance, sue for damages, or take the earnest money to liquidated damages. Well, those three choices are also the buyer's if the seller defaults. However, it's not really equal, because if the seller defaults, the buyer says, well, okay, paragraph 15 gives me these rights. I can sue for a specific performance, which, by the way, is almost always a terrible lawsuit, very hard to deal with. Second, I can go for damages. Third, I get to take the earnest money as liquidated damages. Well, that's your own money. Seller defaulted. Seller decided not to sell the house to you. In fact, sold it to somebody else. You say, well, that's just not right. What do I get to do? Well, one of the things, and the most common thing, is you get to terminate, get your own earnest money back. What? I spent time, energy, and money on this deal, money on option, money on inspection, money on appraisals, and all I get is my $1,000 earnest money back? That doesn't seem right, but that's what paragraph 15 is. It's not exactly equal for the two parties. You just need to have a little bit of a sense of that as you work through it. Paragraph 17. If they have a situation where there's litigation, the prevailing party who wins, has a right to recover their reasonable attorney's fees. That's in the contract. And virtually all the courts in Texas respect that. In fact, Work Audit Committee had to go through a number of language changes to get something in here where the courts would agree with it. However, you need to understand the caveat here. What you really should understand is who actually determines the reasonable attorney's fees is the court. The judge will say, okay, litigation, you prevailed, you won. Here's how much attorney's fees you'll get. Rarely ever does the judge's decision equal what the attorney's fees of the client is. Rarely ever do those match. This judge probably used to be an attorney. He says, I remember how we used to bill, and you're not getting that. Sometimes the judge will give, you know, a third of what the attorney is requiring. And that doesn't mean an attorney can't still charge that client that, but you should understand this is going to be up to the courts on what the prevailing, what the earnest money is going to be, what the legal fees are going to be. Hopefully we don't find ourselves having to use paragraph 17 a lot to work through it. Paragraph 18, again, no blanks, no boxes, but some really important things in paragraph 18. One of the things it does address in 18A is it, you know, it deals with that the title company is not responsible for interest on the earnest money. In the typical residential transaction, not a big deal. But in a commercial transaction where the earnest money is $100,000, could be a big deal. In fact, the parties have a right to agree to a different handling of the interest on that earnest money. 18B gives the title company the right to charge a party who had expenses under the terms of the contract on a deal that didn't close. They have a right to go after that person for that money. And we'll see it also talks about in 18D that if 18C, that if you have a demand for release of earnest money, somebody gets it, the title company has a right to deduct from that particular person who received the earnest money, deduct any charges that they've agreed to in the contract. They don't get to deduct anything from the earnest money for charges that the other party agreed to. It's only the party who agreed to costs in there, like survey, for example, or something in the contract that's been agreed to, and deal didn't close, and that party's getting the earnest money. Title company says, yeah, we're going to collect that $400 for a survey out of the $2,000 earnest money before you get back. And they have a right, and it talks about that in 18B. You don't have a closing, can't resolve the earnest money issue. 18C tells you about the process of how the title company can end up refunding the earnest money with just one set of signatures. And so that's a good 18C thing. 18D tells us that if somebody unreasonably, wrongfully refuses to release the earnest money, then the other party, then they become liable for the earnest money. They also become liable for, reasonable attorney's fees, cost of suit, and also for damages. So there could be a lot there. We used to have a language back in the old days that said triple that, triple damages, but the courts finally said no, didn't have that in there, so they took that out. 19 deals with the seller's right to continue to show property, accept backups. 20 deals with the foreign seller. We've actually had training on that where we had one of the title company attorneys come in and talk to us about that and did a great job. One of the title company attorneys and closers. We had people from Republic come in and do that. Your big thing at a foreign seller, and we now have in the listing agreement, we've got in there where the seller indicates they are or not a foreign person. And if they are, you need to advise them to resolve their issue before closing. If they have any concerns on that, they need to consult with a CPA or a tax attorney. Your big thing on a foreign seller, buyer or seller side, is to make sure and talk to the title company on their procedure. What they do if the seller is a foreign person. Some title companies, if there's going to be a need to withhold money from proceeds of the sale to satisfy tax liability, some title companies are very helpful. Some title companies do a total hands-off. Not our problem, not our situation. It's a buyer-seller issue. They've got to take care of it, and we're not involved. Well, you need to know that before you get to closing. You get as much of that as resolved as you can, because all of a sudden you could have a big surprise at closing that can create a real challenge. So make sure you've got that dealt with. We'll actually talk in the advanced class about the obligations of the listing agent when they know they have a foreign seller, and what obligations they have to let buyer's agents know. We'll talk about that in the advanced class. I've gone through a lot of things here. Any questions so far before we get to 23? Okay, there's a proposed change to the contracts. It'll be its own Trex website now for public comment. The Regulatory Committee has received comments, and they recently had a meeting on it. Trex will meet, their next quarterly meeting is in August. And Trex will likely vote on one of the proposed changes. It's a pretty big one in paragraph 23, where the contract will allow option fees to be paid to the title company. I'm very much opposed to that, but the title companies are behind it, provided they get certain protections. I think it'll confuse a lot of issues as we work through that, but I would suspect that the commissioners, after some debate at the next quarterly meeting, will almost certainly approve it. And so we'll see what happens when we go forward from that. And they'll have, whenever you have a change in the contracts, they'll have voluntary use of the old contract and the new contract for some time frame, and they'll have a mandatory date. If Trex approves these changes in their August meeting, they probably will have a mandatory date in October. Give everybody a couple of months to, make the transition. It's a new one, but it's going to be a new world. And as I pointed out to some people in a meeting I was in earlier, I mean, this is my world. I mean, I love us as realtors. We're the good guys. I've been doing this a really, really, really long time. But God bless us. We get confused so easily. One little change, one little thing, one little disruption. This is going to be a huge shift. And not all title companies will deal with it the same way. Remember, title companies are not a party to the contract. So there's going to be all kinds of challenges. It's going to be a real disruption. But, we'll get through it like we do everything else. But, anytime you make big changes, or actually even little changes in the contract. I mean, I saw when we changed the termination of the option period in at 5 p.m., that's a simple thing. It created all kinds of challenges. People began to believe, well, then I've got till 5 p.m. on the third day to get the option fee to the seller. No, wasn't a change there. But people just, little things like that, they go ballistic on it. So it gets to be a real challenge. Now, so part of it is we're moving more and more to virtual ways of delivering option fees. We talked about this a little bit in a leadership meeting this morning. In fact, you'll be getting, and we'll have up front that there are certain requirements when a buyer or buyer's agent comes in to pay an option fee. There are going to be certain requirements in there. We'll have that posted. And anytime you've got a listing and you get a seller in contract, you'll need to make sure the buyer's agent understands, here's the deal. And that they really understand it, because one of our problems is not only do we have buyer's agents show up with the option fee and not comply with our requirements, we're having the buyer show up. And sometimes they're totally, most of the time they're clueless. We have buyers show up and here's $100 bill and they're not even sure who their agent is. When they really have challenges on what property. We set one up in Allen, bought that one over on the east side in Allen, that really a nice little really. They don't have any paperwork. They have a copy of the contract, so we can know it was done in 3 days. It gets to be a real challenge. So we're trying to move forward, but because of electronic, and if it gets past that, you can take earnest money or option fee to the title company, that's going to make a real shift in how we do that. With the COVID-19 thing, in which many offices are closed all the time, and certainly some on weekends, just like we are on Sunday. You really have to coordinate with a buyer's agent. If you're the listing agent, make sure you can coordinate how they can get the option fee to you, so their buyer can have an option. If you've got the buyer, make sure you coordinate with the listing agent on what the rules are about getting receipted for the option. So it's going to be some really interesting changes there.
Bob, there was a question on backup contracts. When you pay the earnest money and the option fee on a backup offer, if the first contract goes through, does the backup offer get a refund on their option fee?
Great question, and the answer is no. Here's the thing, and we've got a procedure, it's in our intranet, on how to split up the earnest money and the option fee on a backup, and you should make use of that. Now, the buyer does, on a backup, the buyer does have to, at the very beginning, when their backup contract is first a contract, they've got to pay the earnest money and the option fee. But if something happens and that backup never moves in the first position, while they get the earnest money back, they do not get their option fee back. The other interesting little point on that is that the option period, the actual defined option period in paragraph 23, doesn't start until the amended effective date. And the amended effective date is set forth in the backup contract addendum, is when the backup becomes the first contract. More specifically, when the seller notifies the backup buyer that the first contract is terminated. That's the amended effective date. So if you've got a 10-day option period and you're in a backup contract, and then all of a sudden, you discover on July 15th that your buyer's now in the first position, your 10-day option period starts on that day, the amended effective date, which means it'll go to, in that example, July 25th. Now, that's the defined option period. However, because your buyer paid something up front, your buyer had from day one the right to terminate the contract under the option provision, even though the actual option period doesn't start until the amended effective date. Your buyer's right to terminate is there from the very beginning because they paid something. Does that address that, Laura, you think? Semi good on that?
Yes, we had one other question. I'm going to restate what I think I heard you say, and that is anytime there's a difference in possession from the closing and funding, whichever party, both parties need to consult their insurance company, specifically because a seller's policy is a seller homeowner policy, and there's going to be a tenant in the property. Is that correct?
That is correct, because we don't know. In some cases, an insurance company, like for the buyer, says, okay, we understand You own the property now, you haven't taken possession. So we're going to allow under your homeowner's policy, we're going to allow coverage, but here's a rider we're going to put on it. Whatever the insurance company decides, and there is no automatic, this is how that works. It's different for every company. So your buyer needs to talk to your insurance agent, says, here's what's going to happen. Now, almost invariably, they'll have timeline, just like the lender will say to the buyer, we're giving you a good interest rate based on owner occupied. But we see now, you're not going to occupy the property for 60 days. Let me say, we need to put a rider on your policy dealing with the fact that, you're really not an investor. You really don't own the property as an investor. You just, for whatever reason, when negotiating with a seller, they can stay in the property 60 days. So they need
Thank
to
you.
talk to their insurance company. They also need to talk to their lender if it's going to be an extended time frame past, a few days or a few weeks.
Thank
That
you.
is such an absolute thing. I'm glad you brought that up. Paragraph 24. This is really an incredibly simple paragraph, and it's where we tell everybody that agents, license holders cannot give legal advice, and it tells the parties to the contract they need to consult an attorney. This is a legally binding contract. There's all kinds of liabilities. In fact, it actually tells them in paragraph 24, and the language is very clear, consult an attorney before signing a legal document. They really need to understand what they're about to agree to. And paragraph 24 is an incredibly optional paragraph in that you may have a buyer or seller with an attorney representing the transaction. They're still not required to put that attorney's name in paragraph 24. And sometimes the reason they do that is the other side creates a problem because the other side keeps calling up the buyer's attorney. And every time they call up the buyer's attorney, the meter starts running. And all of a sudden the buyer's got an attorney starts sending them a bill because the seller keeps calling them. So sometimes one of the parties' contract says, we're not going to have anything in paragraph 24. And they don't have to. But if they want to put somebody in there, fine, they get to do it. But the big thing here, consult an attorney. And as agent license holders, we can't give you any legal opinions about anything as you work through it. I do have a couple of other things that we've had some questions on the hotline that, some people have talked about. One, contract doesn't close because you've got the seller, contract doesn't close because the buyer just doesn't show up for closing. Couldn't get your money right or whatever. And so your seller wants to put it back on the market and get it sold to someone else, but we haven't resolved the earnest money. You need to understand your seller should not enter into a second contract without consulting an attorney because they may have some liability. They may find themselves in two primary contracts. Because if all of a sudden the buyer shows up the next day or within a reasonable time, then the seller can have to close it. Well, I can't close. I've already sold it to Joe over here. Well, we got a problem. So we need to make sure as they go through that process. And one of the things we also need to remember, because we are having situations where we got a lot of earnest money issues, we need to remind our client, particularly let our buyer know when they write that $5,000 earnest money check, we don't have that. It doesn't go into our trust account. We have no control over it. It goes to the title company. They cash the check. Title company has it, which means any release of earnest money is going to be subject to at least what the title company's policies are on releasing earnest money. You just need to make sure they understand we have no control over that. We don't have the earnest money. We don't get to do that. Let's work through it. Any other good questions that show up on the chat that I ought to be aware of?
Bob,
Yes, sir.
what about I think it's paragraph 13 about the taxes? What if it's around July and you're representing the seller, and then let's say it's a substantial house, say about $1 million closing or something. The seller gives up his portion of the taxes at closing, but then the new buyer, 6-8 months from now when taxes are due, fails to pay them. Is the seller still responsible, and what is our end on that of notifying the seller that just because he closed doesn't mean they're going to be paid?
Good question, James. At closing, all the obligations for property taxes of the seller are handled in proration at closing through the day of closing. So at that point in time, the seller has paid taxes that he owes. Then if later we get a tax bill, what often happens is it's different than what was handled at closing. Because in July, we didn't have the information on what the 2020 taxes were. Well, the parties agree in paragraph 13 as they work through it, that if taxes are not paid or prior to closing, buyers should pay tax the current year, whole thing. But they also parties agree to adjust prorations after tax statements for the current year. We see sometime in institutional sellers that they'll have something either in their addendum or something in the contract where they say, once we close, we'll pay our proration. There's a problem with that. We're not going to cooperate later. Don't call us. We're not going to help you. And if the parties agree to that in the contract, it can. But the seller has no obligations beyond what he's agreed to and what he's paid at closing, except for if there are adjustments that are talked about in paragraph 13, he has agreed to come back and pay those adjustments. Now, I will say most of the time when that happens, sellers are not very receptive to saying, well, okay, yeah, that's fine. They say, I'm not paying anything. We close, I paid what I owed right then, that's it. Well, it becomes a very real buyer-seller issue. And the buyer's going to have to pursue the seller with some kind of litigation. And we are totally standing away from it. All we'll do is provide documents to our client that we have in our possession that will help them. But they've got to understand it's a buyer-seller issue. Because sometimes sellers say, no, I paid, I'm it, I'm done, I'm through, I'm gone. And the seller's moved to Aruba and there's no extradition, so what are you going to do? You just need to make sure your client understands, here's what we agreed to and here's what could happen later as you work through that. Otherwise, they're going to find that they're going to blame you for it. Let's work through it.
So is the seller covered up to it unless there is a different amount when it actually comes out? My question is kind of if, let's say 10,000 is what he gave up at closing, but they credited the buyer for that, but then the buyer never paid anything in taxes. So now,
yeah, the buyer's the one who's responsible. Taxes go with the property, not the person.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Bob?
good question. Question.
Yes. So don't they, at closing, don't they take the rest of the year taxes out of the buyer's settlement?
Yeah, at closing, it depends a little bit on the time of year. The seller owes for everything through the day of closing, and they collect from the buyer the remainder.
Mhm.
Now, they're basing that either on, depending on when it closes, this year's taxes or the most recent. They're estimating that.
Okay.
So the buyer does pay for the remainder of the year. So that, as that in fact is taken care of.
Okay.
Where you run into a real challenge, you're on new homes, and you're going to escrow some of those things, and we don't have the numbers yet. Then all of a sudden you find yourself with sticker shock when they end up with proration, especially if they're escrowing tax and insurance. But yeah, they do a proration at closing, credit buyer and seller, and work through that process. Where you get into challenges, and we probably going to need to have another one of our good title company people and talk about this again and do a class with them. It's when a seller has an exemption over 65, homestead, whatever, and he carries that forward to the next property. Taxes may have been prorated and paid at closing that are really not correct if we don't catch it then. And later the buyer will get a bill because it may be that they don't get that exemption on the taxes they owed, and there was a proration that was done. The seller only had to pay taxes based on his proration, but the buyer doesn't get that proration now because the seller has transferred that exemption forward to a next property.
Okay.
So I think we probably need a good title company to come in,
Yeah, we
talk
just,
to us more about that, because that happens. It gets to be a real challenging situation.
okay.
We good?
Hey, Bob, I have
You have
something
something? Yes, ma'am.
on that. I actually am experiencing this personally. We're the buyer, and the seller went back in 2020 and removed their homestead exemption for 2019, And so we received a delinquency notice saying that we owed additional money. And I have the seller's disclosure saying that there was a homestead on our property and things like that. So I'm pursuing those things to try to get things in line to go to the seller. But in what situation, like, what is the agent's responsibility if it's something like that? Is it?
Well, our responsibility is to advise our client, talk to a good attorney. First thing, you talk to the title company, get an explanation there, or you can talk with the title company attorneys. But when you have a situation like that, you may have closed or be closing at a certain time of the year where what the title company is using are the 2019 taxes. And if the seller has gone through the process and eliminated their exemption from a previous year, and frankly, I didn't know they could do that. It's kind of interesting that could happen. It's a little bit of a surprise to me. But then talk to the title company and say, okay, when we have a closing, what are the taxes? What are the numbers you're going to work on? Are you going to deal with exemptions they have or didn't have, which could affect what you have at closing? But you need to talk to, and depending on which title company it is, talk to one of their attorneys and say, okay, explain this to me again, how this works, so I don't have any big surprises, and get an efficiency judgment or something against me later as you work through that. So follow up with that and let me know what you find out from one of their attorneys. And let me find out, one thing you need to ask is, even Bob didn't know they could go back in previous years and remove exemptions. I've not heard of that.
Yeah,
So
because
really interested to see what they say.
they said that they didn't live in this property since 2018. So it's just something.
Well,
just
they shouldn't have, you from that standpoint, they no longer qualified for the homestead exemption. And they said, we really felt like we were cheating. We just were so guilty, so we're racked with guilt because we weren't paying enough taxes. So we finally owned up to it and agreed to change it. And that makes sense because they really no longer qualified for it. But that's great. Okay, so guys, thank you. Great job. We actually have gone over time. Thank you very much for all your great questions. I really appreciate it. Please continue to be safe out there. And you guys are doing great. We're having record months. I mean, it's just super. We love it. So anything else you need, please call the agent hotline, call me or whatever, and go out and be safe and have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
That's great.
Bob.
Thank
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.